Good afternoon to those of you joining us on our YouTube channel. We are here this afternoon for the second Refugees Talks, and we are going to be discussing our recent investigation into the conditions for refugees in Greece, which looked in depth at the last 2 years, where the funding has been directed, what mistakes have been made, and today's session is going to focus very much on the lessons that can be learned from this. Joining me today, I have Fotini Rantsiou, who is a current UN member of staff, but on sabbatical from the organization. She came back to Greece before the peak flows of refugees and found herself volunteering on Lesbos. She subsequently worked in many roles during the refugee crisis and has somewhat of a unique perspective, having seen things from the refugee point of view, being Greek and therefore having additional insight into what the crisis has meant for Greece itself, but also having something of the perspective of the international international agency professional. So Fotini is qualified to speak across a number of these issues. Joining us as well from Oxford is Jeff Crisp. Jeff was a former senior member of the UN Refugee Agency, the UNHCR. He currently works from the Refugee Study Centre at the University of Oxford and will be a familiar voice from Twitter to many of the people who regularly look at refugee issues. In Athens, we have Marietta Provopoulou, who is the country head for Médecins Sans Frontières, who have obviously been one of the agencies very much on the front line of the refugee crisis in Greece, providing emergency care and playing a number of different roles. Also, MSF has a very useful perspective for our discussion today, because they are not, unlike many of the other international NGOs, they do not take funding directly from ECHO. They haven't been supported with bilateral funding and have therefore had a bit more of a free hand to speak on to some of the more complicated matters. Now, for those of you joining us who haven't necessarily seen the piece about which we're talking about, the investigation was titled The Refugee Archipelago. It was the product of 2 months' work and lent heavily on the research and investigative capacities of Apostolis Fotiadis, who worked with me on the story. Sadly, Apostolis is not able to join us today, but hopefully we will be able to cover off many of the points that he would like to have made had he been with us. We're going to start today's conversation. I'm going to turn to Fotini, was one of the earliest people that I spoke to in this investigation. Fotini, what I'd like to ask you is, to what extent, why was it necessary for an international publication to come in and tackle a story like this? How confused was the situation if we rewind the clock to, let's say, October, November of last year? Over to you, Fotini.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think the investigation was very much needed, and it opened the discussion on the funding to this response. The reasons are two. The situation was far from ideal. There were, back in the time you're referring to, in October, November 2016, the situation in the camps was not acceptable. Winter was approaching and there hadn't been any preparations for it. So that is one reason. The conditions themselves warrant for an investigation. Secondly, the amount of money does not does not warrant for that kind of response. You would expect better response for the money that came into the country, to the INGOs, UNHCR, but also to the government. So these are the two reasons why this was very much needed. But I think that we need to take it a step further as well and look at more detail on the problems. It's not just how much money came, but it's how it was handled.
I'd like at this point to turn to Jeff. Jeff, one of the main findings of the investigation was finally to put a total on how much international funding we know to have come into Greece. The total that we found, and this is bilateral money, it's what we know of in terms of large-scale private donations, and the largest single part of it comes from the European Commission. That total was $803 million. Now, depending on how you look at this, if you bear in mind that the bulk of those funds were directed to the needs and providing services for the 57,000 refugees and migrants who found themselves in Greece after the borders were closed in March of 2016. That comes out at an expenditure cost per beneficiary, as the agencies put it, of $14,000. Jeff, from your experience, is it fair to be talking about this as one of the most expensive humanitarian operations that we've ever seen?
Yeah, I would certainly agree with you. If you look at it on a per capita basis, it's a very telling figure that you've come up with in your report. Obviously, there have been very major humanitarian responses in other parts of the world with probably similar volumes of aid. But when you look at the volume of aid in relation to the number of people affected and the number of people receiving goods and services, then clearly this is quite an unusual situation.
Just to speak a little bit more to the investigation itself, and for people who are joining us today without having necessarily had the time yet to look at it, it does assess the relative responsibility. There has been something of a blame game going on since the cold winter here revealed the extent of some of the organizational failures. What we found in the piece was that there was a serious case to answer from the UN Refugee Agency, that it had failed or been unable to advocate for the rights of refugees, now that it was working for the first time on this scale inside a country that's part of the European Union, and which is one of the UNHCR's two largest donors. Similarly, the European Union had directed very large amounts of funds into Greece, but there was the suggestion from some of the people that we spoke to that they were content, or at least not putting enough pressure on the Greek government to fix the situation on the ground, because the more uncomfortable it was for refugees and migrants in Greece, the greater likelihood was that that would create a deterrent to others who were thinking of coming this way. But a large part of what was found was political failures on the Greek side itself. We spent a large part of the investigation tracing the difficulties that many people found in working with the newly set up Ministry of Migration Policy. While not all of the funding was directed to the Greek government, although the Greek government did receive significant funds, the Greek government did have the role of coordinator and did have the role of signing off on any of the projects that were taking place. Now, that was across the board, and very often it was identified by the people that we spoke to as being the main bottleneck. Just in wrapping up this initial part of our conversation, I'd like to go over to you, Marietta, and if you could tell us a little bit about your own experience and the experience of your agency in seeking to coordinate your actions on the ground with the relevant Greek ministries.
Thank you, Dan. This piece of yours is one of the best briefing papers for our expat newcomers, actually. And it has been particularly difficult for us to coordinate. There are different levels of coordination that I think is worth mentioning, or coordination that should be there. One is inter-ministerial coordination. We had to deal with different ministries, and we had to go and have meetings with different officers or ministers at these different ministries, which they didn't have a communication between them. So that was a big difficulty. Then there was the central versus local problem of coordination. We would negotiate things at central level that were very difficult to actually have implemented and agreed at local level, because central level with local level could not coordinate together. There was the difficulty of coordinating with international actors at times. There was a difficulty of knowing who is responsible for what, especially with the setup of camps. So there has been, everything has been a difficulty of negotiations and coordination. That has been it's been a constant struggle. I would like to note that because MSF has had problems, programs in Greece since many years. So since 2008, we had responses in the north, in the border with Turkey in Evros, working in detention centers. Also on Lesbos before, where people were coming since many years. So we have also worked in detention centers there. Coordination about migration reception system has always been a struggle.
Thanks, Marietta. Just for those of you who are coming on to join us. And now, just to recap on this first section, we've looked back on the investigation that was conducted. We reviewed the fact that there was a responsibility for the failures in Greece can fairly be spread around almost all of the actors, so the UN, the European Commission, the international NGOs coming in, but a large part of the responsibility does fall on administrative failures, critical administrative failures on the part of the Greek government. What I'd like to do for this article largely dealt with the situation building up from the spring of 2015 until the end of 2016. I'd like to use the experts that we have here now just to give us hopefully the latest picture that you can in terms of what's happening in Greece right now for the refugees and migrants who are still in the country. Do things continue to be as bad as they were described as being in the article? And Fotini, because you are frequently, well, you're based on Lesbos and traveling all over Greece, I'd like to come to you first for your assessment of where the situation is today as we're in the third month of 2017.
Thank you. The situation definitely has improved, especially after the media outcry following the snowfall in Lesbos and the pictures from Moria with people in summer tents. They have now moved a few hundred people out of the island. They being UNHCR facilitates the moves. My question is, why wasn't this done earlier? These are people who did not have geographical restriction. They could have been moved to the mainland earlier. Secondly, within 3 days after the call by UNHCR, they found 400 beds in hotels around Lesbos to move people from Moria. And again, my question is, why wasn't this done earlier? So it was not, because often the hotel owners are accused of not making accommodation available. But here we have an example, a very concrete example of when they asked and they got it immediately. At the moment, they are expanding, sorry, not expanding, but renovating parts of Moria with double-decker containers. So they're putting one container over another, and that's creating better space for everyone there. But I want to also mention Karatepe, which is the other camp on Lesbos, which is the responsibility of the municipality, and how much better the conditions are there. You never hear about Karatepe because conditions are good. So that also links to what Marietta said earlier, that you have bad coordination between interministerial and what have you, between local authorities, central authorities, but when you know which authority is responsible, then it's easier. So Karatepe is one case where you do know who is running it, and it's run very well, and you have someone who manages it. In Moria, for 1 year, we had a gap. There was nobody in charge of Moria. In the urban areas, in Athens and Thessaloniki, the relocation accommodation has expanded, and lots of people are in apartments, guest houses, hotels. But I want to also point out, just to show the complexity, many people are allocated apartments, and they prefer to remain in camps, especially the good ones, like Eleonas in Athens. The reason being that they don't want to be isolated in an apartment in a big city. So they prefer to go back to their community. Sometimes they go, they look at the apartment, they go back to the camp. Most of the camps around Thessaloniki have closed. Some are being renovated. So generally there is a movement in improving the conditions, but it's coming. We should start now be talking about summarization, and we're actually still dealing with the tail end of the winter. So that's not good enough again.
Well, thank you, Fotini. For those of you not familiar, the camp that Fotini has been talking about, which is Moria, it has certainly been the one that's received the greatest amount of international attention. This is the hotspot registration reception center on the island of Lesbos, which received the largest number of refugees over the last year, with a total of just over 1 million having entered Greece. More than half of those have come through Lesbos itself. The conditions at Moria camp have often been a lightning rod for international attitudes to the handling of the refugee crisis in Greece. And Moria was also the place where three refugees lost their lives this winter. The suggestions are that the causes of those were related to the cold conditions and the tents that they were forced to sleep in, although there's still an official investigation underway by the Greek authorities. Marietta, I'd like to come over to you next to get your assessment of the latest conditions. What do you see as the challenges? Fotini's mentioned that we should be looking at summarization. The temperatures are going to change. The challenges are going to change. What do you see as the main needs right now and for the coming months?
Just because every life matters. The number of people who lost their lives because of the lack of winterization is 5, because we forget the woman and the child that died when the canister exploded before these deaths. Yes, so now it is indeed the summarization. It is about time to now foresee what's coming in the summer. So again, having worked in projects for migrants and refugees in Greece for the many last years, it's the same thing. No matter whether we're talking about small scale or big scale, there is always a failure to respond to the season coming, whether it's winter or whether it's summer. So next challenge, clearly, summarization, preparedness. In Greece, temperatures in containers or temperatures in tents, if the external temperature is 40 plus, you can imagine that inside you cannot breathe, so that requires some adjustment. And the story at the moment is that we have In the mainland we have different camps. It's still an archipelago. Maybe there's less, but it's still an archipelago. And we have people in hotels or in apartments. I can't know if the people in the camps are more than in the people in apartments or not. There's a big confusion with numbers, so it is not clear. It is very important. There is no excuse that 1 year later, after following the closure of the borders, we have a population that still resides in these conditions in camps. These people have to be integrated. They have to live closer to an urban setting. Fotini's comment about these people's needs to be with their communities is very, very important. And because at the moment, people have their mental health because of the hopelessness and the conditions that they live in is bad. Feeling supported and having an environment that supports is very important. So the Greek state has to seriously tackle the issue of integration of these people. And I can't say that much has been done at the moment if we still have people living in camps. The islands is the other part. Okay, as Fotini said, we have the conditions of the people in the islands where there has been significant improvements. It's all relative, but significant improvements to what we had before, following post the media attention on Moria. Nevertheless, what we see, at least as a humanitarian medical organization, is that many people are vulnerable cases. They are in need of special services, special medical services, they need accommodation, and these needs are not covered. So we still have there's a lot to be done, We can't say that the situation is good by any means today.
Thank you, Marietta. I think it's clear that there's a danger with winter having passed, with the focus having been on freezing conditions for refugees in tents. It's important that the focus doesn't remain just on that one issue. The arrival of winter was an indicator of the chaos going on behind the scenes. I have not talked to anybody credible associated with this who's been able to make an argument that the resources made available were insufficient. And some of the bad relationships that have existed and the poor coordination that's gone on between international actors, the Greek government, volunteers on the ground have added to that. While it seems that the immediate pressure on the camps on the mainland is not as bad as it was, the situation has the potential to pitch over into becoming dire again. I think it's clear that comes across from both Fotini, from Marietta. In the next section, I'd like to go on to look at what lessons can be learned from this. Part of our motivation for devoting this amount of time and attention to issues in Greece was it felt to us as though there was an opportunity to cull some lessons from the crisis and get some idea of what some of the big international actors who are going to find themselves in equivalent situations in the future, what they could have done differently and what their takeaways might be. So to get that rolling, I'd like to turn to you, Jeff. In your capacity as a former UNHCR person and as a keen observer of the UN and its evolving role in this, what would you say are some of the main lessons from their side, from what you understand of what's happened in Greece?
Well, let me begin by saying that I've not been directly involved in the operation in Greece, and I've not had the opportunity to visit it. So what I'd like to do is to put the Greece operation in perhaps slightly broader and historical perspective. I think if you look back in time, until the early 1990s, humanitarian action wasn't really subject to very much systematic criticism or analysis. It was just assumed that humanitarian was a good thing and that it had good consequences. And I think that changed significantly in the early and mid-1990s with the crises in the Balkans and the Great Lakes region of Africa, where we began to see that humanitarian aid could actually have unintended and negative consequences. And that experience in the mid-1990s really led to an extremely intensive debate within the humanitarian community over a number of issues. For example, the effectiveness of aid, whether aid provides value for money, the degree of transparency shown by aid agencies, particularly in relation to where their money is coming from and what it's being used for. And most notably, I think the whole issue of accountability to affected populations was a very important part of that debate. And just watching the Greek operation unfold from a distance, it just seemed to me that those debates that we've been going through for the last 20 years simply didn't take place. You know, clearly the aid in Greece was not effective. There seemed to be very little transparency about where the money was going to, and a number of us systematically asked questions about where the money was going to. We didn't get very good answers. And clearly, looking at those pictures of people freezing in flimsy tents with snow all around them, there was very little sense of accountability to affected populations. And I guess what I find most surprising about the Greek situation is that it took UN refugees deeply to really look into this and to try and come up with some better understanding and explanation as to what exactly went wrong. And I really would have thought that the humanitarian actors themselves, not only UNHCR, but the others who received significant amounts of money from the European Commission, I really would have thought that either individually or collectively, the humanitarian community would have felt obliged to subject the situation to a bit of comprehensive and systematic analysis by undertaking an independent inquiry or commissioning an independent evaluation. There's very good examples in the past of UNHCR, for example, commissioning independent evaluations of emergency operations that didn't seem to go too well. It happened in Kosovo in 1999, in Somalia in 2011. And I've just been very surprised that nothing of that type has been undertaken either by the individual agencies or by the humanitarian community as a whole. And I think in that respect, we need to congratulate refugees deeply for making the first attempt to try and explain what exactly went so wrong.
And Jeff, if I could I get you to address the issue of what was new in terms of what the UNHCR was doing in Greece, how this was a new role, and whether or not you think working inside one of your major donors.
Hello. Hello? I'm not sure if anybody can hear me. Can you hear me? Okay, look, it's a very good question, Daniel. And I think it's very true to say that this was quite an unusual situation for UNHCR. Of course, in the past, UNHCR's been used to working with large camp-based refugee populations, primarily in some of the poorest countries in the world and some of the weakest states in the world. That has begun to change more recently with the situation with Syrian refugees in the Middle East, where UNHCR has been working much more with urban refugees and refugees not living in camps. But I think the Greek operation did take UNHCR's activities into a new phase. It was operating in quite a difficult environment, not materially, but in the sense that it was working in an environment where during the initial stage of the emergency, at least people were on the move and didn't want to remain in one place, which was quite an unusual context for UNHCR to work in. I think it was working in a much stronger state with much stronger structures than it is used to in many places. I once wrote an article about the way in which UNHCR acts as a surrogate state in many developing countries, and it's a very powerful institution. In a country such as Greece, that simply wasn't the case. And then thirdly, I think, as has already been mentioned, and perhaps somewhat perversely, UNHCR found itself working in a context where money wasn't in short supply, which is very an unusual context, and I think that also had some adverse consequences. So certainly was a new environment. I think the other issue you've raised, which is a very important one, is the extent to which the source of the funding for UNHCR and other humanitarian actors limited the extent to which they were prepared to go public and to admit that the deficiencies of the response, and even to explain why the response was not effective as it might have been. And I think it's very difficult to draw a direct line of causality between getting European funding and agencies being reluctant to criticize the European Union and its member states. But I think there's a very large presumption that that was indeed the case, and that much more could have been said about the limitations of the response by the humanitarian agencies concerned.
One of the other novelties of this crisis, let's say, or one of the new features that came up in it, was the deployment of ECHO. This is the European Commission's humanitarian operations wing, more accustomed to operating in Africa than in southern Europe. They're stepping into this and being the vehicle for a lot of the funding that came in was something new. I know that you, Fotini, have some thoughts on ECHO and what they might have been able to do differently. Do you think they could have possibly adapted their mandate in a smarter way in order to intervene in the crisis in a more effective way?
Yes, ECHO, as per its mandate, was not supposed to be operating inside a member state. They had to amend their mandate to be able to operate in Greece and to fund operations in Greece. So there's been a lot of debate about the source of funding, both internally in Greece, and the government often blames the fact that the money is going directly to NGOs, although, as you point out in your article, the planning is in the hands of the government, so really they have to get the thumbs up at least before they do something. So in order to remove that argument, you could say that the humanitarian funding, which is ECHO, could go to the government, which would be it would be a first again for ECHO. The funding that's coming directly to the government is coming from Directorate General for Home, which is mainly busy with border controls. So it doesn't really go towards humanitarian assistance as such, except for the food that goes through Ministry of Defense. So anyway, not as to confuse things more, but just to show that there is a lot of nuance that often is lost. But I think that we need to say something about the system of implementing partners. UNHCR does not implement itself. There's very little that UNHCR does by itself. And one of the things it does alone is advocacy. That's why I insist on the advocacy. However, the implementing partners, which means UNHCR gets one of the big NGOs to do something, and they get a smaller NGO to do something, that means that money is lost in administrative costs every step you go down until the assistance reaches the beneficiary. The other thing that we need to say about this particular response, the urbanization, the urban response, is that indeed, as Jeff said, UNHCR is much better in responding in camp situations, and although everybody says that living in an apartment gives more dignity and more independence to the refugees, it's not done very well. It is also very costly, but not only that, the vulnerabilities are more difficult to follow up when you have to travel in Athens from apartment to apartment. So social workers have to do all these rounds. Just one more thing about the accountability to affected populations, because it is one of these slogans that we use in the humanitarian world in the last few years. In this case, because of the easy access, especially for Europeans, we've had thousands of volunteers, and in a sense, the voice of the refugee was hijacked by volunteers who either didn't know enough or may have had good intentions, but not enough knowledge or understanding of the situation. So they hijacked the voice of the refugee. So our accountability became our accountability to the volunteers rather than to the refugees.
Thanks for that, Fotini. On the subject of volunteers, and one of the features of what's happened in Greece was this was possibly the largest number of European volunteers we've seen come into a humanitarian response. Marietta, if I could ask you to speak a little bit to that, whether there's any kind of takeaways, any lessons to be learned in terms of how agencies can work with volunteer groups or smaller groups. The common thing that's said is that smaller NGOs and volunteer groups are more agile. They can get things done more quickly. They can deploy and start immediately helping people, and that sometimes larger organizations have more bureaucracy and can be less effective. Do you think that's a fair accusation? And what do you see? What have you personally learned in terms of the balance between the role and the help that volunteers can give and the role for professional aid agencies with experience like your own?
Okay, I'll cheat now a bit. I will make a statement that goes back to the former discussion. It is very difficult to have effective humanitarian aid if you don't have, as part of a total inhumane policy. So since the humanitarian aid in this, not just in Greece, across the Balkans as well, in terms of the former transit situation of people, but also following the closure of the borders, are part of a deterrence mechanism. There's a conflict of the funding and how does it come and under which central planning does it fall and how effective can it be. Now going to the volunteers discussion and the size issue. Yes, indeed, the volunteers did cover for a long time the gaps that were there and did provide essential assistance to many people, especially during the months that thousands of people were transiting and the organizations were still not there. One of the problems of the effective response was that when money came in, the money went into big international organizations. Most of them just showed up in Greece for the first time. So they needed time to establish systems, to recruit the people, to train their people, to understand the context, negotiate their plans. Whereas there have been, because Greece has been at the forefront of a migration flows as being one of the countries at the doorstep of Europe for many years, and small local organizations have been there. Volunteers networks have been there on the islands, for example, for many years, have been always at the forefront of a response in terms of humanitarian aid. And these were not necessarily the people that were supported or received the funds or the attention to continue to do the job or to scale up what they were doing. MSF, this experience here has been particularly important. One of the lessons learned we draw was how important it is to work in such a context with these volunteer groups. So we have made them part in some of our interventions. So providing the means, for example, to carry out some distributions when we couldn't be there, or to provide some, let's say, skills, knowledge, so that they can do the job later. They have been of exceptional importance to the response of the refugee crisis in Greece. So there needs to be a balance. big structures, big organizations. That's a criticism, an internal criticism as well. They have complicated mechanisms. It takes time to make the internal agreements. You know, that's a very good trade-off to be able to be more effective on the ground.
Thanks. Thanks to Marietta. Just to recap for anyone who's coming into the conversation now, we're talking about lessons for the big international organizations. We've just Jeff's looked at the UN's role in this and looked at the way over time that what we thought was some progress that had been made in terms of accountability for big humanitarian responses and aid agencies' activities in general, how a lot of that progress seemed to evaporate when it came to the situation in Greece. It very much felt like going backwards on this. Fotini made some good points about the use of the EU's own agency and how its mandate could have been adapted a bit more smartly when it came to operate for the first time inside the borders of the European Union. That's certainly something to think about for next time. And Marietta made a good case for the need for large organizations to learn from and work with smaller organizations and voluntary groups, and how a lot of that has actually happened in a positive way in the Greek context. For the last part of this conversation, I'd like to pick up on something that Marietta said, which I think is tremendously important. That we shouldn't forget that Greece was given a dirty job to do. Greece doesn't choose to be on the periphery of Europe. It doesn't choose to be the frontier of the European Union, and neither would it have chosen to have its borders north into the Balkans closed. And it was something of a bystander in the major deal that influenced the outcome of the refugee crisis in Greece. This, of course, was the deal struck 1 year ago between the European Union and Turkey. In summary, the deal saw Turkey agree to take steps to minimize flows of people out of Turkey and into Greece. Under the terms of that deal, Greece was also expected to return new arrivals back to Turkey, and larger flows of refugees who qualified were going to be brought out of Turkey and into the European Union. Bearing in mind that that deal is now 1 year old, and Jeff, if I could, I'd like to start this section just by getting your thoughts on EU-Turkey deal 1 year on.
Well, I guess what I find a bit depressing is, despite all of the enormous amounts of money that you've already mentioned that's been spent on this situation, you know, we don't really see a way forward for the future. Brussels is judging the EU-Turkey deal by one criterion alone, that is, has it stopped people coming? And by that simple criterion, one could say that it's been successful in the terms that Brussels has it. Of course, some people are still arriving, but there are many other kind of continuing and troubling aspects of the situation. As far as I understand, there's a growth of smuggling out of Greece, because people can only get out of Greece that way by paying very large amounts of money. We still have people, of course, crossing into Europe by the central Mediterranean route through Libya, although I don't think that's directly connected with the EU-Turkey deal relating to Greece. We've still got 50,000-60,000 refugees in Greece with no idea what's going to happen to them. The relocation program not really picking up the kind of speed that one might have hoped for. We've got the possibility of eventually returns to Turkey, and I understand the possibility of refugees and asylum seekers to Greece from other parts of the European Union if the Dublin Agreement is kind of re-invoked. So despite all of the action that's been taken and all the money that's been spent, despite the attention that's been given to the EU-Turkey deal as a means of stopping the movement, in terms of actually finding lasting solutions for the refugees concerned, we don't seem to have made much progress. And looking forward, it seems to be quite a gloomy situation.
Thanks for that very realistic look at that, Jeff. One of the most interesting and disturbing aspects of the EU-Turkey deal is that essentially it calls inevitably for the creation of detention centres on the Greek islands. Fotini, from your viewpoint on Lesbos, what's the future for islands like Lesbos and Chios? Is there an end in sight to their role as something of a buffer zone, even between Greece's own islands and the mainland? What do you think? What's your sense of the mood and the feeling from islanders themselves? How do they feel they've been treated in this?
For sure, the islands are being used as a buffer zone or as a hurdle for refugees. So the first hurdle is the sea, the second is the islands and more sea, the third is the mainland, then it's the fences all along. And this is the logic that's prevailing. The islanders are the islanders have been nothing short of spectacular in the reception of refugees. And we shouldn't forget that. But they are very tired of being treated like that, of their places being treated as small, an island is a prison in a way, because if you don't have a boat or if you can't swim to the next place. So they don't want their places to be treated like that. But we need to remember one thing. That refugees not coming is not because of the conditions on the islands or in the mainland. The refugees are not coming because they are not facilitated by Turkey. The refugees have been the pawns of the politics in Turkey. And if Turkey decides to use them again, they will do it. I don't like to exaggerate, but really, I don't think that we grasp the immensity of how manipulated the situation is. But just to close on a positive note, I think that if more people come, if people remain on the island, the islanders will continue to help out. Now, if they create detention centers, I think the islanders will also take to the streets. And demonstrations are organized for this week, for the 1 year of the EU-Turkey deal in Lesbos. But sorry, I need to add, this is also a Greek tradition, demonstrating about everything.
Indeed. Marietta, just coming to you in closing, depending on how you choose to look at this, the flows of people into Greece are nowhere near what they were a year ago. The situation on the mainland, the camps are in slightly better shape than they were previously. Despite all of the waste, some things have been built, some things have been deployed, some lessons will be learned. The numbers in Greece itself are going down. The relocation program, this is the program by which other member states inside the European Union agree to resettle people who have passed and qualified as refugees, so to remove them from Greece and Italy and relocate them to other countries. It's moving slowly, but there is a trickle of activity in that direction. It could be argued that there's nothing to see here, it's time to move along. Marietta, MSF has taken a stand over what it sees as refugee politics that are incompatible with human rights. Do you see, is there any part of you that looks at the situation now and sees that maybe the realists were right, and that these seemingly harsh policies have gotten the situation under control? Any doubts in that direction from your standpoint?
It's only doubts. So today, we published the report Alternative Facts 1 year after the EU-Turkey deal. For all the people that have the chance to listen to us, it's on www.msf.org. We have expressed from day one our strong opposition to practices that basically use people as commodities. We're talking about political deals in the expense of human lives. We in this report, we show through our programs and our patients the amount of suffering and death increase in other countries. There is one very big lesson learned, not from this so-called, we completely oppose ourselves to this definition used, refugee crisis, but also on all experiences across history. When people need to save their lives, when people have to protect themselves, there is nothing to do to stop them. So flows, some numbers will always keep coming. We have a country, one country away, Syria. There's a big problem. Policies like this of deterrence, the only result they have is to basically take, the problem far away. The big problem is not about what we see here, actually. What we have been discussing for the last hour about the problems we see in Greece. The biggest problem is about what we do not see here. It's all about keeping these poor, miserable people away, where they really risk their lives. So all the international organizations, NGOs, the civil society, everyone has to go against this type of agreements and policies of deterrence. And we have to promote and we have to ask that alternative migration management as policies are being implemented that will not cost to people the way it is today. So less people will die, less people will suffer. And at the same time, the benefits of this will be definitely greater than the situation that has been created in Europe today, where by European mismanagement of migration, we have a price of extreme right rising, political debates between member states, EU as a whole concept not having the means to, let's say, impose a common policy agreement. So yes, this is clearly not the way. And I really ask everyone to read this report.
I'm sure many people will. Thank you, Marietta. It remains for me to thank my three panelists. So Marietta from MSF in Athens, Jeff Crisp from the Refugee Studies Centre at the University of Oxford, Fotini, who is at the airport in Athens and took time to join with us this afternoon. I'm very grateful for you being here. I won't attempt an easy, simple summary of what's been said. The point of this investigation was to embrace complexity. It wasn't a 900-word article castigating the EU. It wasn't a polemical against the UN, and neither was it a witch hunt against the Greek government. It was an attempt to delve into how these things actually work. And I'm immensely grateful that so many people took the time, almost 30 minutes, according to our own reader, to tackle, take on and absorb the investigation that we did. It's, as Marietta said in her summing up, it's one of the major issues that's shaping politics in Europe and beyond that. And one of the interesting things that comes across quite strongly from the panel today is that people who really know their stuff believe that a different kind of refugee and migration politics is possible to what we're seeing at the moment. And there's nothing to say that what appears to be calm 1 year on after the EU-Turkey deal could actually be the concealment of potentially great build-up of great pressures and movements of people. Thank you to all of the panelists for taking part. Thanks to those who've joined us on YouTube. We'll be back with more investigations and with more refugee talks in the future. Until then, thanks very much for joining us.